So allies and combined arms in Warhammer 40k? Are soup lists still worth it? Or is it all about the pure faction army these days? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about the pros and cons of including allied detachments in your list. In 8th edition, for a while at least, soup's multi-faction army lists did seem to be the order of the day, but as the later codexes have rolled out and the changes have come into place in 9th edition, people seem to be running their factions as pure armies more often than not. Today we're going to talk about the positives and negatives of including allies, and then go through all the factions in the game that can ally, with a few thoughts as to how well they work when they're mixing it up a bit. So first up, here we have a few of the benefits and negatives of including allies in your army. In 9th edition there really are quite a lot of costs to including allies, not least of which is the command point cost of including extra detachments in your army. If you're planning on using 2 detachments or more anyway, then it might not be that much of a big deal, but a lot of pure faction armies can get away with just using 1 detachment now, so typically allied lists do tend to have fewer CP than pure ones. Allied lists will have a little bit less synergy within the army. For example, say if you were allying Admech and Sisters of Battle, various character auras and buffs that go from one unit to the other won't have any effects between the 2 factions, which can make the army just a little bit less strong as a whole. Say if you had a Canoness for the Sisters, buffing some Retributors, if those Retributors get gunned down, you couldn't just move her along to buff the Cataphrone Destroyers sitting right next to her, as they're not from the same faction. Increasingly throughout 9th edition, we seem to be getting more whole faction army buffs, such as Space Marine combat doctrines, Grey Knight Tides of the Warp, Necron command protocols, and now with the first Chaos book of 9th edition, it seems that Death Guard are getting their Contagions of Nurgle for that -1 toughness aura. Naturally, whenever you're losing these buffs, you are making the units in that detachment weaker, so for those armies that have them, you really are going to have to do something pretty special with the allied detachment to make the army stronger, not weaker, when you are losing those buffs. Finally, you might be forced to buy some unwanted HQ choices that you might not necessarily have wanted or had to include if you weren't taking multiple detachments. And for those armies that do have a 9th edition codex, you gain access to a fair few 9th edition special secondary objectives, and you won't be able to take any of those if you are taking allies. Overall, there really are quite a lot of ways to make life easier for yourself if you are just taking 1 army and 1 detachment. To counterbalance all that though, there really are some decent advantages to taking allied units. It stands to reason that if you have a couple of codexes, some of the units in each codex are just really strong for the role that they occupy, so you can take the best units that are good for one job from Codex A and combine them with the best units that are good for another job from Codex B. For example, combining the ridiculous firepower of Space Marine Eradicators with some really solid durable screening units such as Cerberus Raiders from Admech. You've basically just paired some ridiculously strong anti-tank firepower with some really good screening. Some armies in 40k aren't the most well-rounded in the world, and they have some inherent weaknesses built into them, and you can often ally to cover those weaknesses. For example, Imperial Guard have kind of limited melee options, they've got Bulgarin and some Katachan infantry, and very little else. They're certainly an army that can really profit from having a few really strong hard-hitting melee units included from another faction. As well as the units and combos themselves, of course you get more stratagem options, you'll get the stratagems out of 2 books rather than 1, and often means that you're getting more bang for your buck, even if you do have fewer command points to start with. Finally, as the rules stand at the moment, you will be able to combine different relics and warlord traits from different codexes. Say have a Space Marine warlord as your primary, and then include a guard warlord trait and relics brought in with stratagems as other options if you wanted. The way that the new Warlord trait and relic stratagem from Codex Space Marines is worded though does imply that this might get more limited. You can only take extra Warlord traits if your Warlord was already an Astartes Warlord, so that might be setting a bit of a trend for future books. Overall, how much these factors matter really does depend on the army that you're choosing. It's really a question of whether the best units with the best chapter tactics or regimental doctrines can outcompete the cost in command points, lots of things like combat doctrines, and the other negatives of being split across multiple detachments. So let's go through a few specific factions in turn then, starting with the Space Marines. Space Marines kind of have 2 levels of allying, either they can ally with other Space Marine chapters, in which they lose their super doctrine ability, or the other Imperial Armies, in which case they lose combat doctrines altogether. If they're just mixing and matching within Space Marines, then it means that you can do some basic dividing of duties, such as having a more shooty chapter take care of the guns, and perhaps a more melee-focused chapter charging forward and getting into combat. Whether the trade-off is worth it really depends on what chapter you're playing and how good their super doctrine is. For example, White Scars have a really good assault doctrine with +1 damage on the charge, so they're not really going to want to mix and match as much as other chapters. Having the advantage of multiple chapter tactics, loads of extra stratagems, and different options for warlord traits and relics is pretty potent though. If you're choosing to mix Space Marines in with other Imperial armies, then of course you're going to lose combat doctrines altogether, and people don't tend to do it all that commonly competitively, but I do think that it can have its role. Extra AP with combat doctrines really is quite a decent buff, so typically if most of your force is Space Marines, it kind of makes sense to complete the last bit of your force with a few more Space Marines, rather than allying in something else. I think typically if you're allying in Space Marines, it works better if they're the smaller part of the alliance, as you can just focus on getting some of the good bits out of their army and adding in a bit of Space Marine power to other Imperial armies, meaning that losing combat doctrines isn't all that painful as it's only on a few units. In particular, combat doctrines are a lot more important on things with low AP attacks. It means that if you're allying in things like Eradicators or Blood Angels Sanguinary Guard, they're not going to care all that much about not having them, as they already have very, very good AP. The opponent's not going to be getting much of a save against them anyway, or they might be taking them down to an invul. Eradicators in particular don't really care too much if they're AP -4 or AP -5, it's all the same versus most targets. In terms of specific chapters and exactly what they can offer, Ultramarines can deliver a really potent Plasma Inceptor bomb, drop 5 of them alongside a Lieutenant with the Seal of Oath, and you've got potentially 20 shots with plasma weapons that reroll all hits and wounds. Ultramarines can do some pretty nasty shenanigans with pre-game deployment moves as well, which can be a really good option. Iron Hands can make a shooty dreadnought a character and untargetable, plus their troops can be quite good for securing objectives with a 6+ feel no pain. Raven Guard can deep strike Centurions or Eradicators, not Obliterators as I seem to have written there for some reason, but basically having these massive damage output units arrive just next to the opponent is something that they usually can't do, plus they have some useful pre-game move options if needed. Blood Angels, I'd say one of their main strengths is bringing Sanguinary Guard to the table. They're a truly excellent melee unit and could easily be used in soup. If you're wanting an HQ choice for them as well, the Librarian Dreadnought can deliver a very fast threat all the way to the other side of the table, potentially on turn 1. For Dark Angels, you could get near unkillable Terminators or near unkillable ATVs with an Apothecary. Deathwatch could give you their various kill teams, including Obsec Bikes, or a bunch of Redemptors sporting a 5+ invul save from a relic on a captain with a Storm Shield. Imperial Fists can give you ignore cover and boosted firepower on any bolter-related troops. Space Wolves, White Scars and Black Templars all have their own flavours on decent assault units. They've all got good stratagems, relics and psychic powers, or their own unique chaplain listeners for the Black Templars. Finally, Salamanders, while being quite strong, are probably one of the chapters that I wouldn't ally in quite as much. Getting +1 to wound on melters is really, really nice, and not something I'd want to pass up if I could avoid. They still have some solid options though, including flamer-related stratagems, and +1 to wound on any of their core units via their stratagem. Moving on to the other Imperial armies now. A small guard detachment could get you some very nasty artillery fire support from Manticores, cheap mobile infantry for objectives with move, fearsomely strong demolisher tank commanders, and maybe some Bullrun to hold the centre field. As a faction themselves, Guard are really lacking in terms of melee. Maybe some squads of Sisters Repentia or Sanguinary Guard from Blood Angels could be a really good fit to mix in. Admech have these excellent Cerberus Raiders, which with their pre-game move, very tough profile and ability to run away when charged are some of the best screening units in the game. They can go for Data Horde Cataphren Breaches, Fuselage Bombers for mortal wound shenanigans, and boats full of Fulgurite Electro Priests for some melee threat. As a primary faction they do tend to do shooting quite well, but I feel like some other melee variety might really help them out. Fulgurite Priests are very strong, but they are perhaps a bit limited to one style of play. Sisters of Battle have some of the best melee units in the game with Repentia, and their Miracle Dice can get them some really reliable charges, and they can also dish out similarly heavy firepower to the Space Marines with Retributors with Armorium Cherubs. When allying in other things, they will lose their Sacred Rites, though to be honest I would argue it's quite a small super faction buff compared with something like Combat Doctrines, and I think that they could be helped out by some other heavy long-range firepower if Exorcists don't really fit all that well in your army. Custodes I seem to have been seeing run pure more than most other factions. I think it's kind of hard to include a small detachment of Custodes alongside other things just because it's so expensive, and by the time you've met the minimum detachment requirements, you've already spent a very sizable number of points. I think their elite nature though can be balanced out a bit with a few cheap units. I think they pair quite well with units like Astra Militarum Scions, who can drop all over the board and secure objectives and things, while the Custodes focus on getting the killing done. I'd say this is perhaps even more exemplified in Imperial Knights, who pair really well with cheap units. You're never really going to want to have a knight standing around doing an action or holding a home field objective, so having a few grunts on the guard or admech can really add to that. Plus if you're admech, you can potentially use Knight of the Cog to make the knights even stronger. Now super heavy detachments cost quite so many command points though. I don't think that people are going to be including just one random knight in their list anywhere near as much as they used to at the height of their power in 8th. Finally, I think Grey Knights are one of the factions that most want to be run pure out of the Imperium. Their Tide to the Warp is a really significant buff, particularly to their durability in cover, and also as they have a very decent amount of psychic powers, they typically want to have as many Grey Knight units on the field as possible to profit from those. In general, the Imperium is the army with the most options for allied forces, though in particular with combat doctrines, I think it has discouraged allied armies quite a bit, as Space Marine players make up quite a lot of the field, and it is hard to give up all of that extra AP, particularly when Space Marines in themselves are quite such a well-rounded army. Next up we come to the forces of Chaos, who tend to be very much on the other extreme, and in terms of very strong tournament lists, about as many as not tend to be running allies. In particular, if you are playing a Chaos list, and you aren't running Chaos Demons as your main faction, then it's very tempting to include a bunch of Nurglings as an allied detachment. They're pretty much one of the ideal units for 9th edition, object troops that start very far forward, can gum up all the midfield objectives, and are just unreasonably durable to pretty much any firepower. Can very easily be worth the command point cost. Chaos Marines have access to a lot of decent powerful stratagems from Faith and Fury, things like Alpha Legion auto-exploding vehicles and using intercept stratagems, or Night Lords using their Vox Scream to shut down auras. Warp Time and Prescience also work across multiple Heretic Astartes units, so can combo really quite well with Death Guard or Thousand Suns units, say using a Chaos Sorcerer to zip Mortarion across the board for turn 1 charges. Thousand Suns, despite struggling somewhat as a faction in 9th edition, still have really potent tricks with their Psykers and Demon Princes, and I think that they're an army that really benefits from durable screens as an ally, whether it's a bunch of Demon Horrors or just loads of Nurglings. Death Guard can provide a durable and resilient core to a battle line, with their demon engines such as Defilers, Mephitic Blight Haulers or Plague Burst Crawlers, and those same demon engines can have some good synergy with the Demon Codex, as a lot of their spells work off the Nurgle Demon keyword, so you can potentially repair them with spells from a Poxbringer, or even go the whole hog and get Epidemius on the go and buff up all their stats in various different ways. Finally, with the Exalted Greater Demons being quite so strong at the moment, a lot of people seem to be playing the Monster Mash version of Chaos now, with things like a few Keepers of Secrets, maybe a Lord of Change, perhaps combined with Demon Primarchs, a Lord Discordant or two, or even Chaos Knights. If the opponent can only reasonably deal with 1 or 2 big threats a turn, and if you have a whole ton of them running at you, then they're going to have problems. Finally, the other super factions in 40k are Aeldari and Tyranids. Orcs, Tau and Necrons can ally within their own codexes, and sometimes mixing septs, dynasties and clans can be the way to go, but they lack any options for allies from one codex to the next. For Aeldari, in general most Eldar factions will be made stronger by adding in at least some Harlequins. They're fast, hit incredibly hard, and have some amazing tricks for keeping them safe from enemy return fire. Harlequins just seem to be significantly stronger than the other Eldar factions at the moment. Having said that, they do have quite a limited unit roster, so sometimes Harlequins themselves can benefit from a small amount of Eldar allies, either from Craftworlds or Drukhari, just to provide some long-range fire support options which they don't really have access to within their own codex. I've seen quite a few lists throw in the Incarn as well. Definitely adds a bit of a twist with a pop-up threat that could hit the enemy very hard where it hurts. For Craftworlds and Drukhari, in general Craftworlds tend to want to have quite a large amount of their own units on the board if they're the main faction. It kind of makes sense to make a lot of use of Doom and Jinx if you have access to them, though currently I would say that Craftworlds are one of the factions that are struggling most in 9th. Dark Eldar might struggle as well compared with Harlequins, but they can provide some abnormally tough units for holding objectives with their Covens, and fairly good multiple small units for grabbing objectives. Finally, we come to the Genestealer cult, who can ally with both Tyranids and Imperial Guard via Brood Brothers. I'd say that Genestealer cult are quite good allies in an army that can provide really quite a lot of threats with just a few units. Just having 1 or 2 big blobbers of acolytes deep strike in very close and then go to town on the enemy out of nowhere can be really quite powerful, and a good addition to either army, even if you are running majority Brood Brothers or majority Tyranids. In terms of lists that have been doing well in tournaments so far, it seems that the Genestealer cults have had more success allying with Tyranids than Brood Brothers, combining some devastating assault units from Genestealer cult with perhaps some of the more shooty Nid units such as Exocrines, Hiveguard or Rippers. Brood Brothers could be potentially useful though, Tank commanders, artillery, and infantry with orders are all good things to add to the list, though I think that the Brood Brother units will be wanting to play quite a different game to any of the Genestealer cult units themselves. So overall, I would say that allies are alive and well in 9th edition, even if they're not the absolute go-to that they were in 8th. In particular, Chaos seems to have some great cross-faction synergy, and frequently seems to make the use of multiple books, though I think that perhaps Imperial allied lists aren't coming to fruition quite as often as I might have expected. Maybe it's more of an indication that quite a lot of Imperial armies can function quite well within their own codex, rather than having to ally things in to cover essential weaknesses. In any case, let me know what you think of allies down in the comments below, particularly if you've got any combos that you're regularly using in-game at the moment. I look forward to hearing all about it. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll have regular 40k content coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you are enjoying my videos, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's monthly giveaway with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link can be found in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.